This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Jeff Goins. His new book, Real Artists Don't Starve, Timeless Strategies for Thriving in the New Creative Age. Jeff dismantles the myth that being creative is a hindrance to success by revealing how an artistic temperament is in fact a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Look, this whole starving artist mantra has been pushed forever. It's nonsense. Mindset, technique, understand the right direction, understand the right perspective. Jeff Goins goes there. I hope you enjoy this conversation today, because I sure as hell did. So Jeff, I must tell you, anybody in this day and age who can get a Johnny Cash quote into their book, we're already friends.
Love that guy. I live in Nashville, and he made his home here for many years, so I wanted to give an homage to Johnny.
Yeah, you talk about stealing from people. No one's been able to steal from him, really. He's kind of still the original Man in Black. I think once he was gone, I don't know if there will be another one quite like him.
It's such an interesting sound, so interesting that people didn't really know what to do with it, especially at a time when, Elvis was becoming a big hit and Johnny was completely different. And yet, as we find with so many creative people, he wasn't setting out to do something original. He was just doing the best he could with what he had, and stealing from his influences. And what came out was something that, we still aren't able to quite replicate today.
You can go find his, I'm sure you've seen them, the YouTube clips from the 50s, his first versions of I Walk the Line and stuff. And it's just amazing. He's in his 20s and he kind of looks like he's 50 then.
He was an old soul with an old voice. Yeah.
It is great, though. I love his stuff. So listen, here's the thing that I go through your work and I read it and I'm like, if somebody would have handed this to me in advance of the last 20 years, I would like to think that I would grasp it all. But having gone through my last 20 years, mostly online and books and stuff like that, podcast, I read this and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's check, 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 every last damn point I've lived. I couldn't describe it myself, but you've described it all. So I appreciate that.
Well, thanks. When I read a book, I love what Seth Godin says about books. They're gifts. The idea of a book is, you're giving away a year or 10 years or a lifetime worth of knowledge and advice and wisdom in a $25 package. And so it has to be a gift, because it's just, absurd that you would work that hard and, sell it for so cheap. But that's the world of books. But when I've read, a great book, it's, the experience that you're describing, Michael, is what I felt, where I go, this feels so obvious and familiar to me, yet I never would have put it, like this. I lacked the language to describe my experience. Now, this person is telling me, whether it's a novel or a memoir or a business book, they're telling me how I feel before I can even bring language to it myself. Those are the gifts that I received from other authors, and I'm grateful to hear that you had a little bit of that experience with my book.
Yeah, spot on. But I must say that I would think that if we went to, before we even get into some of the content, if we went to, and this is an endorsement, at least Mike Covel's type of endorsement, if we took this book and we took it to the college campuses, even though you write in a very lucid way, it really flows and there's great examples, great context. Ultimately, your big picture message to me feels like two bulls hitting each other. You got Jeff on one side with guys like me, Mike, saying, God, I really love this book. And then on the other side, you have the traditional learning college system in America. And it's like two bulls hitting each other. Am I completely nuts? Does that make you crazy if I say it like that?
No, not at all. I start the book with this idea of the myth of the starving artist. And I've gotten some interesting feedback on that idea where people are like, well, it's not a myth. It's happening, everywhere. I know, my friend or my sister or my dad was a starving artist. And I go, look, and I know it's possible to be a starving artist, but let's think about what the word myth really means. And a myth is a story. Some myths, are actually true, or they were true at some point, and they kind of turned into a tall tale, or they're just, stories that we tell ourselves culturally to make sense of the world around us. And so there are religious myths, there are patriotic myths, but myths help us understand the world and our way in it. But they're just stories. It turns out that a myth, even the myth of a starving artist, is a story that if you tell yourself it long enough, it becomes true. My challenge, whatever the myths that you're believing today are, for example, this is a myth that we hear a lot, Mike. I went to college. Maybe I even went to graduate school. I have my MBA, but I can't get a job. Somebody lied to me. I believed a myth. I believed the story that, parents told us in many ways, teachers, culture. If you go do these things, you're going to be successful in life. And we have lots of people in our culture today who are going, this didn't work out for me as well as I was told it would. And I think the idea of the starving artist is the same thing. But the opposite is true. It can actually work out better than you were told. And all I'm trying to do here is tell a different story. You can be creative, whatever that means to you, and be successful. These are not diametrically opposed today.
You might not think of yourself like this, and perhaps the book is not written this way, but I would love to just go into your basic first example, even though you cover a lot of territory using a lot of really well-known names in your book. The Michelangelo example is almost something, the way that you have pulled your sources together and told the story from your perspective, it's very much like an investigative journalist. And in that sense, you have that aha moment of like, oh, hold on. Why don't you explain that? Because for me, I had the aha moment. I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, me too. And I appreciate you saying that, because in the introduction of the book, I was just trying to replicate my experience of stumbling upon this story. So several years ago, a friend of mine went to Florence, Italy, and he met this tour guide who was basically showing my friend Joe around the city, basically said, well, Michelangelo was rich. Really rich, and here's his house over here, and there's this house over here. And my friend Joe, who's a writer like myself, was like, really? And he kind of started digging into it, and he came back, and I was actually getting ready to go to Italy myself, and he's like, you got to go there and meet this tour guide, because they're going to tell you all about Michelangelo. And he sent me this article about an art historian named Rab Hatfield, who discovered in 2003 how rich Michelangelo was. Now, if you studied art history in college or art school or whatever, then you may be a little bit familiar with the fact that Michelangelo did okay. But until 2003, and even today, a lot of people don't know this, we didn't know how wealthy Michelangelo was. I spoke with this guy, Rab Hatfield. He was in his 80s. What happened was he was looking. He was a professor, an art history professor. He was looking at the Sistine Chapel, trying to figure out when Michelangelo painted which part of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, I think, took about 3 years, and so he painted it in segments. Professor Hatfield had this realization, well, he probably received his commissions in segments. And so if I can go to the bank records, I can find out when he painted, this piece based on the letters that he wrote, because he wrote a lot of letters, and he, in the letter he's talking about this piece, and then I see this commission. I go, okay, I've triangulated that he did this in 1501 or whatever. And so he goes to the bank records. Literally, he goes to the archives. Had a friend there in the city of Florence. He told me he looked up the letter M, and he finds these bank records. And there are these incredible sums in the bank accounts belonging to Michelangelo during that time, and he's just kind of blown away by it. It's like several $100,000 in each of these bank accounts. He keeps looking and looking and looking, and he uncovers a fortune belonging to Michelangelo worth the equivalent of, in today's money, which would be about $47 million. Nobody had any idea about this. And Michelangelo, even during his lifetime, would call himself a poor, starving servant of other people's work. I talked to Professor Hatfield about this, and he said, well, they always told me that he was kind of like Van Gogh and he was a starving artist. And it turns out that's not true. The reason I start the book with this idea is because if the Renaissance greatest artist, which Michelangelo arguably is, he's one of history's most accomplished, most skilled artists ever. If the Renaissance greatest artist is also the Renaissance wealthiest artist, which he was hands down wealthier than all of his peers, then what does that mean for us today about this big gap that we see between art and business, which right now are not, like this is a conversation that's happening where we're talking more about creativity in the business world. But for the most part, if you go be an artist, we understand culturally you're probably going to starve. And if you go be a business person, we understand that you're probably not going to be doing the most interesting and innovative and creative work because it's all about the bottom line. This is kind of the dichotomy that exists in our minds today for most of us. I just want to argue that doesn't have to be true.
It's a myth.
Right. That's right.
What's really interesting too there is that you find the professor, you talk to the professor, and he seemingly doesn't have any sense that this number is terribly important.
Yeah, I asked him, and I included this in the book just because I thought it was fascinating. I said, what do you think that means for us today? He goes, well, I don't know that it means a whole lot, which I think is like a standard professorial thing to say, right? Like you're very deep in your subject and you're going, well, this is interesting, but I don't know if this has any impact on the art world today. And I go, well, I think it might just change everything. The reason I wrote this book is because my friend sent me this story, and I would tell people like you, Mike, I would go, did you hear about this? Did you know this? And everybody goes, no, I had no idea. That's so interesting. And I'm like, every time I find something like this, I go, this is interesting. And I just write books to kind of satisfy my curiosity and understand what those ideas mean in the context of our world today. And so I just kept asking, what does this mean? And in and of itself, it probably doesn't mean a whole lot. But while this is happening, I keep meeting two groups of people, creatives, on two different sides of the money divide. One, starving artists going, man, like I just can't get published, or I can't make enough money off of my music, or I'm starting this business and it's just not taking off. Whatever your art is, I meet these people who are really skilled, really gifted, really creative, and they're just struggling. And they have this certain mindset, which is, I'm supposed to struggle. Like this is just how it is. And I live in Nashville, lots of musicians. And there is this idea, even amongst some of the successful musicians, where it's like, well, it's really hard and you just have to get lucky. And I'm always skeptical of that because that's not very helpful or hopeful. And at the same time, I met these people that I call thriving artists who are killing it. And I'm not talking about famous people. I'm talking about everyday, ordinary people who are authors and designers and painters and musicians and entrepreneurs who are making a great living off of their art. And I see two different stories that these people are believing. And so I think Michelangelo is a great archetype for this story of the thriving artist, that if we believe this story, it also becomes true.
What's great about it, though, too, is that the average person, the average, let's say artist, the average artist, without the right, you mentioned mindset, without the right philosophy and without the right technique, I mean, that's kind of the dividing line. I see that's where your book is going, because you're taking this traditional starving artist view and saying, hold on, let's draw a line here. Let's look at what is really happening on both sides of the divide. And I think for the, quote, starving artist today, and if somebody's listening who thinks they fit that bill, you've got to really make the admission that perhaps you've got a bad philosophical foundation and perhaps bad technique. Because, as we're going to explore in this conversation, there are a ton of artists that have took it in a commercial way without selling out, so to speak.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you said it perfectly, Mike. Like if I could, succinctly summarize this message in a sentence, it would be being a starving artist today is a choice, not a necessary condition of doing creative work. And you're absolutely right. Like you can do your best work and not sell out and still make a living.
Let me take you back in time a little bit before we dig into the book a bit. I want to find out what makes you tick. I mean, as a guy who's written books, who's a guy who pulls from a lot of different sources, I can feel the commonalities in your work. So I feel like to some degree, even though we might be in different disciplines, there's a very common path in a way. And I can tell that you're not 21, by the way that you write. You can tell when someone's got some scars and some perspective and gets the context. How did this start for you? I mean, you're giving this great advice. How did you go down the path? Who was the first person that gave you the push, either an expected push or an unexpected push?
One of the things that I am really interested these days is the idea of apprenticeship. Our mutual friend Ryan Holiday talks a lot about this because he had a unique experience that a lot of people don't get to have, which is to apprentice under Robert Greene, a successful author, and get to actually see what it's like to write for a living. That's always fascinated me because for most of my adult life, I've been looking for a mentor and kind of being disappointed until I realized that most of us have multiple mentors that come in and out of our lives. Life is apprenticing us if we're just looking for the opportunities to learn. So that first crappy job you get after high school or college, that's an apprenticeship. That second crappy job that you get, that's also an apprenticeship.
Hold on, you mean me in the warehouse at Circuit City moving TVs was actually an apprenticeship when
Absolutely.
I was 19? Okay.
Yeah, because you can. If you have the mindset of a student, and life is your classroom versus this kind of entitled mindset, which is I went to college, I got this degree, now give me my dream world, right? Like I literally talk to people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who still have this mindset. Versus going, wherever I go, whatever I do, whatever opportunities come my way, I'm going to learn from them. So I have this idea that life has always been apprenticing us, and I kind of stumbled upon this idea a few years ago. So how it began for me is through what I call an accidental apprenticeship. Like when you look back at your life and you figure out what you're made to do. And I really do think in those terms. I believe in calling and vocation, and that our life's work is more than just a career choice. It's a calling. It's something, deeper and kind of spiritual. Anyway, and so I consider, writing my calling. I fell into this, one part unintentionally, one part intentionally. The unintentional part was I was always kind of being apprenticed for this. And so the first person who kind of helped me on my way was my mom. I love what Derek Sivers says when he says what's obvious to you is amazing to others. So if you're trying to find out like what your thing is, whatever that is, your one thing, your craft, your vocation, and I don't think it has to be one thing, by the way, but if you're just trying to figure out what should I do with my life right now, I think that formula, like what's obvious to you that's amazing to others, is a pretty good one. When I was 27, figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, I was a marketing director at a nonprofit and just felt like that wasn't where I needed to be. I started just kind of looking back at my life and going, what's always been true about me? Just a few things kind of stuck out to me. One thing was when I was, 7, 8 years old, we would go on these road trips, my family and I, and we'd drive to Niagara Falls, 12 hours in that direction. We'd go to Louisiana to visit my aunt, 12 hours in another direction. And we'd go on these long road trips. And my mom, who always loved English and wasn't really great at any other subject, she would read me the dictionary. Like this was normal. And then I remembered, and so that memory stuck out to me.
That's one of those great early things to have happen. That sounds weird, probably when you're
weird.
When you're a kid, but when you're an adult, you're like, oh wow, that's so cool. I'm so lucky to have that happen.
It just felt normal to me, and it's something that was obvious to me. I thought everybody did that. And then in 6th grade, I win the school spelling bee, and the winning word was acquiescence. And I beat this 8th grader, and he went home and, cried. And it was the only time that I ever made an 8th grader cry, which I was happy about. Words were just always a part of my life. In high school, I started a band, and my favorite part of that was writing music. In college, I would sneak away to our computer labs. I didn't have a computer, and I'd go to the computer lab at like 2 o'clock in the morning during finals because I was so stressed. And the way that I would de-stress is I would write. I would write little essays or stories, and I would email them to myself. And this whole time, I never thought I'm going to be a writer. Why? Because I always understood that to be, like you could make a living off of that. Writers starve. I was trying to do other things. And then at 27 years old, I go, oh, maybe this is like, maybe there's a reason I've done all these things. Maybe I can use all this. Maybe I can be a writer. And I love what Parker Palmer says about this. He says, before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I need to listen to my life telling me who I am. And at 27, I realized my life was telling me that I was supposed to be a writer.
I love the quote you have from Stephen Pressfield in your book. When does a writer get to call himself a writer? You are when you say you are. Now, you could easily remove the word writer and apply just about anything, as a replacement. That construct, though, boy, that's tough for people. I don't know what percentage of the population as a whole really believes that. I believe it with every fiber of my being. It's the moment you declare you are, then you have to back it up, of course. But speak to that. It's such a great line.
Well, I mentioned Ryan Holiday earlier. He and I had a conversation about this, and he was like, is this true? Because you could just have a bunch of fakers running around saying, I'm a writer. You kind of got to do the work, right? And I said, absolutely. And so there is, there is an art to this. But one of the things that I do, in addition to writing books, is I teach online courses for writers. And I got to tell you, Mike, the number one thing keeping writers and creatives and artists from sharing their work, which is good work, with the world, is a lack of confidence in themselves. They just don't believe they're any good. And we all know people like this, right? Who are walking around going, I suck, this isn't any good. And you can feel it. And that's not attractive, right? At the same time, we know people who are just 100% fakers. For me, owning the title, whatever it is, artist, entrepreneur, whatever it is, that the thing that you want to be, I think you have to first believe that this thing is in you and that it's possible. And so when Steve told me that, he says, you are when you say you are. I said, okay, I'm going to start calling myself a writer. Because I started putting myself out there, people would obviously go, well, what do you write? and I was like, oh, hang on a second. I'll be right back. Let me go write something. And putting myself out there forced me to do the work. And I know so many would-be writers and artists and entrepreneurs who have some big idea, and it's in their sock drawer. Because they never really claim the title and say, I am this thing, they don't have to put themselves out there. They don't have to do the work. And so I think this is a way to sort of force yourself to take yourself and your work more seriously. And then the necessary next thing is for you to get to work. And so I don't believe we fake it till we make it, but I do believe that we believe it till we become it.
When I go through your book, I have a hard time imagining that your college career is in those pages, meaning what you learned in, quote, college classes. I don't feel like I see in those pages. I feel like what's in those pages came from somewhere else.
I just recently spoke at my alma mater and went out to lunch with a bunch of students there. And I asked them, I said, because I'm a dad now, I'm in my 30s. My wife and I have a savings account, a college savings account for our son and our daughter. We're not sure if we're going to, essentially force our kids to go to college like our parents kind of did for us, because the world has just changed so much. So I asked these college students who are essentially more than a decade behind me, I said, hey, do you regret coming to school here? They said, no, I don't regret it. But the things that I've learned here, in class, I know are not necessarily preparing me for my job, but I learned that through this internship or this or that. And so it was interesting because I mean, when I was in college, I thought I'm getting prepared for the real world. And then I got into the real world and I was like, oh, this is very different than what I was told. In Real Artists Don't Starve, to me, this is the stuff that nobody ever told me, particularly about being a creative person, being an artist. Because in high school, I was a musician. In grade school, I was a cartoonist. And in college, I was kind of dabbling with the writing thing, but I wasn't an English major or anything. In a lot of colleges and universities, there is sort of this starving artist mentality. And it sort of surprises me. It's even kind of propagated by professors. I wrote this book because I just couldn't find a ton of evidence for this idea that being creative means that you have to starve or suffer or struggle. And so once I stopped believing that stuff because it wasn't working for me and decided, I'm going to be a writer. I was working for a nonprofit at the time, fundraising my salary. I had to make a living. All I had was this writing thing. And I was like, I'm just going to figure this out and just assume that there's a way to make this happen. And when it worked, I was like, this is cool. Can other people do this? I didn't know. Like, did I just get lucky? And I kept meeting so many people, and I kept seeing these threads. They all kind of did the same thing. As you said at the beginning, you go through life and you go, oh yeah, this makes sense to me. But nobody talks to you about this. Apprenticeship, you've got to figure out how your craft is actually done by watching a master do it and then follow in his or her footsteps, whatever that looks like. But you have to kind of mimic the master before you get to go be a professional, a true professional yourself. You go through life and you learn these lessons. And I thought, what if I could just write these things down? And, I call them rules. I'm not a big fan of rules, but most of the thriving artists, very successful creatives, again, in business, in fields of publishing and writing and literature, visual art, music, they're doing most of these things. And most of the starving people are not doing most of these things. It seems to me that these are the things that once you make it, they're obvious, but when you're struggling, you're going, what am I doing wrong? These are the things that you're either doing or not doing.
To whet people's appetite, to take them through some of what you call the rules of the new Renaissance. I don't want to go through them all right now. I think people should read them all. Plus, it would take us many, many hours. But to go through a handful, I think, are to give people an idea of where you're coming from. The starving artist strives to be original. The thriving artist steals from his influences. I'll give a quick, brief story in my world. So I'm in this I started in this kind of trading world. There were other trading books long before my first book in 2004. What I found, though, was that these folks were not tackling a niche that was inherent in their work. They were being more general. And I kind of just said, okay, well, this niche that is inside their bigger work could be its own work on its own. And that was kind of how I started. And then I just looked across the universe, from LexisNexis to every piece of, forget Google if you really want to find information that's not there, but just every piece of data that I could piece together. And it was kind of like a threading type thing. You get all this raw material, and then you figure out, what's my perspective on how I'm going to take this raw material to present something novel. And I think that's the point that you're making about steal. People don't like that word steal, but you don't have to think of steal. We're not talking about breaking the law here. It's more of an homage. You're saying something nice. You're stealing from influences. But walk the audience down that perspective from your view.
Well, the publisher didn't want me to use the word steal. I said, guys, we have to use this word because anything nicer than this is not really honoring what great creative minds actually do. So what did Steve Jobs do? He stole from Xerox. He took all their ideas and made them better. And when Bill Gates, I love this story, when Bill Gates, comes out with Windows, right? What does Jobs do? He goes after Gates and says, you stole from us, and you stole all our ideas because, they had, that kind of graphic user interface long before Microsoft did. Gates says to Jobs, he goes, the way I see it, we both had this neighbor named Xerox. We both break into their house. But when I break into their house to steal something from them, turns out you were already there. And no, we're not talking about anything illegal, but we are talking about how true creativity happens. It's not invention, it's iteration. A great book on this by, an academic researcher is Group Genius by Keith Sawyer. And he talks about everything from psychotherapy to, all the inventions that Edison created to a lot of the robber barons, from business to science to art to psychology, how all of these creations came about not as a result of one lone genius going, Eureka, I figured it out, but rather by borrowing from a bunch of different influences and then recombining them in a way that has never been, before combined. So it is original in that sense, but the source material, as you mentioned, Mike, is nothing new. Nothing new is under the sun. I love what Will Durant, a historian, says. He goes, nothing is new except arrangement. And I like that idea. I think that speaks to...
That's a great line. That's an absolutely fantastic line.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it speaks to what it takes to actually be creative today. And I see so many writers, musicians, entrepreneurs banging their head against a wall going, I just need a big idea. I remember talking to a couple coworkers of mine years ago, and they wanted to go start a business. And they said, we just need one great idea. I said, you think that what it takes to launch a successful business is one great idea? And they said, well, yeah, you just need one really great idea. And I was like, okay. And I mean, that idea is absurd, but this is the way a lot of people think. And it turns out that history's most successful artists, entrepreneurs, and creative minds did not come up with an original idea, but they took something old and they arranged it in a new and more interesting and better way.
As you talk, I don't know if you've seen the movie, and I'm not going to give it away, but The Founder about Ray Kroc and Michael Keaton.
Right, I did see that, yeah.
So fabulous. We won't give it away to people, but the part that's great about that, and I'm sure some people will have a different perspective, they'll say, well, gosh, Ray Kroc just stole from the McDonald's brothers. The issue with this stealing, too, is many times the originators aren't going to take it the way that the quote stealer is taking it. The person that is stealing is taking it in a novel way and breaking ground. And clearly, when you watch The Founder about McDonald's and Ray Kroc, the brothers were not going to do what Ray Kroc did.
That's right. Yeah, I had the same takeaway from that movie. The movie paints him in a bad picture. My in-laws actually run a McDonald's, and they had a similar impression of him being kind of on the inside. And certainly, I think there's some things that maybe he could have done better. But I walked away from that movie going, well, like, he did have a vision that was bigger than theirs, and he didn't break the law. This is kind of the way business is done, and they were a little bit foolish, even going so far as like doing a handshake deal on getting a 1% royalty and going, oh yeah, we're not going to put that in a contract, but we trust that he's going to give that to us. I'm like, no, don't do that.
One could argue that the McDonald's brothers early on were so uncooperative that there was a very good chance that what Kroc was trying to do could have failed, and somebody else could have beat them to the punch to be the first quote McDonald's. Yeah,
I mean, I watched that movie and I thought a couple of things. One, it's like their vision is a lot like Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out Burger and even Chipotle today. They had a vision for a high quality, high speed experience, a takeout food experience that had never really been done before. And they did that by doing what? By stealing from everybody around them and doing it better. And I watched that movie going, man, what if they would have done what Ray did? Like, could they have even done it better if they had the vision? And he saw it, and he did it. This whole idea of stealing, is really, you're just, you're borrowing from a bunch of different influences, and you're hopefully giving credit where credit's due. Especially if you're, a writer like me, you're recombining it in a way where people go, oh, wow, like this is interesting. To get a little bit nerdy about it, there's a researcher by the name of MICHAEL Covevel who wrote like the
best name on the planet.
It's so fun to say, so hard to spell. MICHAEL Covevel. He's got a great TED Talk. He's the flow guy. Yep. He also has a book called Creativity, where he did this decades-long research project about what it takes to be creative with a capital C, meaning you basically do something that's never been done before. You change your domain. And there's all these steps. There's 5 steps. And the last step is what he calls elaboration, which essentially requires you to pay attention to your colleagues. And he says when we interact with others involved with similar problems, it's possible to correct a line of solution that is going in the wrong direction and to refine and focus one's ideas. What he's saying here is you need to look at your peers and the people who came before you, the people in your industry. Watch what they're doing. Do it better than them. And if you do that and you borrow, you elaborate on what's been done before, you are going to do something creative.
To reach back for one more example from the founder, when he's listening to that early self-help record, persistence. Isn't that the thread that's throughout your entire work? This only works if you're persistent. If you quit, you'll never understand everything that you have put in this book, Jeff. It just won't make any sense if you quit. You've got to keep going.
Yeah, I like thinking of it as patient persistence. If there's one key to success in any field, I think it's that. For years, I told myself, because I would see people who were luckier than me. I mean, come on, we all have friends where we go, God, that would be awesome. You know, we all got this friend who's just doing all these things, and it just looks like, come on, like luck had to be there somehow, because I'm really trying and things are just falling in, his or her lap. And then there's people who just seem to be ridiculously talented. Like I have a friend who is an entrepreneur and he's a marketer, and just like I run this little business, teaching online courses, and then I write books and speak. And that's kind of my two things that I do. And my friend, I mean, like, he's always like 8 steps ahead of me, and he started 2 years after me. And I'm just like, I always feel dumb around him. And I think there's always going to be people who seem luckier than you are, seem more talented than you are, and are almost kind of lazy about it, right? Early on, I told myself, okay, like, I can't control that. All I can control is me. And so I would tell myself, well, what can you do? Well, you can always outwork the lazy, and you can always outlast the lucky, because luck eventually runs out. And if somebody's talented but lazy, you can just work harder than them. And that's always been my mantra. I'm going to be patiently persistent and just keep showing up. When you do that, I think good things happen.
So let me push back a little bit with your ridiculously talented friend. Sometimes the ridiculously talented, they kind of give off that vibe that it's natural talent. But we don't necessarily see behind the scenes. And to source your work, I'll let you run with it. Why don't you explain how one of America's foremost comedians in the last 20 years is well known for practice, and this would be Chris Rock, but a kind of practice that I didn't know he did, and it's it's the kind of practice where, as I mentioned on my Facebook today before we got on here, practice in public. Practicing in public is not easy. Why don't you tell that Chris Rock story? Fabulous.
So to be clear, I don't really believe the whole natural born talent thing. I think I've read almost all the books on it, and there's like a small sliver of the population where you go, okay, yeah, like they were just born that way. There's a great book called The Sports Gene about that. But for the most part, incredibly accomplished people were not born with talent. They acquired a skill. And sometimes it was, kind of accidental. Like Tiger Woods playing golf with his dad when he's 3 years old. Like, at that point, he's just playing with his dad. And it turns out that he accumulates tens of thousands of hours of practice long before most of the people that he's going to compete against. But I am kind of I believe that most of life is a meritocracy, and certainly that's not true across the board, and there's hidden privileges and things like that.
It's enough true that where people should be believing the deliberate practice, like Anders Ericsson's Peak book. I mean, believe that. It's worth it to believe that.
Yep, yeah. So, but what's interesting is you see somebody who's doing it. And you're like, man, they're amazing. They're so talented. And what we're telling ourselves when we say that is they work just as hard as I do. Therefore, they're just born better. And so I can excuse my lack of skill because we must be working just as hard. And the truth is, often they're working harder, or they've been working longer. And Chris Rock, who's incredibly funny, has this very interesting practice. And I found this is one of the rules in the book that, a lot of artists are afraid of marketing. They're afraid of putting their work out there. I was talking to a writer today who was afraid of whether, should she write fiction or nonfiction, because she doesn't want to get pigeonholed and she doesn't want to fail at that. And she doesn't want people to see how bad she is at one or the other. And it turns out that thriving artists just do it anyway, and they put their work out there. Call this practicing in public. What Chris Rock does is pretty fascinating. For every show that he does that's televised, or you've got, thousands or tens of thousands of people in attendance, long before he does a show like that, he basically goes on a mini tour in his hometown and does a show a night, and he will randomly just show up unannounced in a nightclub with a legal notepad, and he wants to test out new jokes. And you know how big and boisterous Chris Rock is? He doesn't do any of that. He walks up on stage and he reads these jokes, and people boo And they walk out, and then occasionally he'll get a laugh, and he'll go, "Oh, that's funny," without any kind of exaggeration, without people laughing at me for who I am. That's actually funny. Okay, I'm going to circle that. And he basically goes and he bombs night after night, week after week, month after month. And what he's doing is he's refining through failure, through intentional failure. He's refining his set down to a bunch of different bits. So when he goes and, performs for a live paying audience that is actually there to hear him speak, he's ready for them. And so it just turns out that when we see somebody performing at the top of their game, we don't see those tens of thousands of hours, those years and years of practice that have preceded this moment. It turns out that just about every successful creative person I've ever met has that.
He has to test. And that is also another one of your rules here of the New Renaissance. The starving artist does his work in private. The thriving artist practices in public. Just to restate it, let me bring up another one, which I really, really love. And you've got a great example, which would be the starving artist sells out too soon. The thriving artist owns as much of his work as possible. I live this every damn day. I know, for example, that there are hedge funds and brokerage firms that if they took the footprint that I have, they would raise a lot more assets. I'm not in that business. They would raise a lot more assets than they otherwise do. The question for me, though, is what do I want? Because if I take that big chunk of change, then what do? I like doing what I do. You want to find that right point in time. You've got a great story with an artist that I admire, Dr. Dre. Why don't you run that through for the audience from the early record label connection with his rather tough guy partner, who I think might be in jail today, all the way up to the with the agent and the headphone deal that's become quite successful.
In the book, I talk about this musician who is actually the opposite of a success story. He gets a big record deal, and like a lot of people thinks, "Oh, I've made it." His name's Stephen Kellogg, and he was a pretty well-known musician in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I talked to him, and he's an independent musician today. Like a lot of indie musicians, he's just kind of jaded about the whole experience of getting picked, as Seth Godin would say, just signing deals and going, okay, yeah, this sounds good. And it's kind of sad because he didn't own his work, and when he sold off all his work to a record label, essentially thinking that the system was going to take care of him, it didn't work out that way. And it turns out that this is often the case. If you trust a system to take care of you, you're in for a rude awakening. And so what the thriving artist does is he tries to own as much of his work as possible. And so take Dr. Dre. A lot of rappers, Jay-Z is another example, are really good at this. They're really kind of keen on the business side of their art. And Dr. Dre is great. I love him. But when he starts out with NWA, same thing happens. They get a record deal. They basically make no money. And Dr. Dre has to walk away. He starts Death Row Records with Suge Knight, who's basically a thug. And it becomes really successful. I mean, they start signing all of these artists that become really big, like Snoop Dogg and Tupac. And Suge is just, like he's very violent. It's not going well. Dre walks away from that too and moves on and starts another label called Aftermath. So, here you have basically two failures, because when he walks away from Death Row, he leaves his 50% stake in the company, which is a multi-million-dollar company at this point, and starts Aftermath, where he discovers Eminem and 50 Cent. Over the course of his career, he, realizes first mistake is I let the label take care of me, and it turns out that the label and the manager, they were making bank off of NWA, and all the guys in that group weren't. And so then he goes and starts Death Row. Same deal. He has a partner, doesn't have full ownership, realizes when you have a partner, you're beholden to that person. Not to say that it doesn't work, but what's the saying? The first ship to sink is a partnership. And so finally he starts Aftermath, and he goes, okay, I've got to have control over my art, and because I have to have control over my art, I have to have control over the money side of it. So he starts Aftermath, becomes very successful, and then eventually starts Beats. and sells it for almost $1 billion and becomes, I think, like one of the first truly billionaire musicians. What's cool about him is, first of all, ownership, especially for an artist, is not just about like doing one thing. It's about this new kind of mastery, the portfolio life, the idea, and you get this given what you do, Mike, the idea that your art is not one thing. It's a bunch of different things, and it's a portfolio of investments where you should be investing your time and your talents. But as you do this, you're trying to maintain as much ownership over this as possible. And yes, there may come a day where you're going to cash out for $700 million or whatever to Apple, and that's a good way to sell out. But most starving artists sell out too soon. They sell their art off too soon. They sign a $50,000 book deal, and a year later they go, well, what do I do now, right? Or they sell off their business, too soon, and it turns out that from Pixar to Dr. Dre to Jay-Z to even Michael Jackson, that history's most successful musicians, artists, entrepreneurs typically made great art and made a good living by maintaining as much ownership of the business side as possible. And when you sell that off too soon, you shortchange yourself, and you also lose control over your art.
Let me add one. I'm looking at a Wikipedia entry right now for David Geffen, who founded DreamWorks, but back in the 70s, he founded a record label called Asylum, named after that because, most people thought he was kind of nuts for the artist he was signing. But he did sign the Eagles, he did sign Linda Ronstadt, he did sign Fleetwood Mac, etc. Today, he's worth $6.5 billion. I don't think any of the artists that I just mentioned are worth anywhere close to that. So there's a great example of some of the most famous artists, some of the best-selling albums of all time, and all of the money went to a very smart, essentially, agent.
Wow. Yeah, and I mentioned Pixar. John Lasseter went and worked for Disney and did this in the 70s when Disney wasn't doing too well, worked on The Fox and the Hound, and was like, guys, we can do better. And he goes to his boss with all these ideas about how they can make better films, because Lasseter, growing up, watched all these Disney movies and was just taken with them. And his big dream was, I want to go make cartoons for Disney. And he got this dream job in the 70s and 80s. Pictures that Disney were making just weren't that good. He goes to his boss and says, let's do this. And he has all these ideas. And he says, we can change everything. And they were so focused on the bottom line that they were shortchanging their art, and they fire him. And he goes, okay, all right, I got to go get a job. And he goes and gets a job working for this company that George Lucas started, and then eventually sells off to Steve Jobs, starts Pixar. Same kind of deal. And their thing is they're building this computer, right? And that's what Pixar is the computer that creates these graphics. And then they make these cartoons to demonstrate what this computer that they want to sell to, businesses and stuff, like what it can do. Lasseter goes to Jobs and says, hey, I know we're already in debt. I know we're not profitable, but give me a bunch of money to go make a short film. Jobs goes, okay, but you have to make it great. So they go and they do this. It wins an Academy Award. And, long story short, they start working on Toy Story. And around this time, Disney actually offers John, they say, hey, come back to Disney. We'll pay you 3 times what we were paying you before. And he says, no, because I want to have control over the work. And here, I've got control over my art. And so, that's an example of even taking a short-term loss to have a big-term win. Pixar, a lot of people don't realize, was really what made Steve Jobs a billionaire. When that first film came out, they did an IPO, which was kind of unheard of for an animation company. It went from basically being worth nothing to being worth $1 billion in a day, all because of, I think, one man's refusal to sell out too soon, and that was John Lasseter.
And by the way, I'm looking at his wiki entry right now. His net worth, Lasseter's net worth, $100 million. So he made some good choices too.
He did okay too.
Let me wind down with one great last line, because I'm sure there could be some skeptics sitting out there saying, you guys are cherry picking these great stories. You pick the winners and all this other kind of stuff. You've got this line in here from Cicero, which I just think is fabulous. I wish I would have put it in my book if I would have seen it. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. Boy, that's, you've written a very friendly book, but that's a very tough line. That's a punch to the gut for people that might be saying, "Oh, I don't have to know anything before me. It's all just me right now, today, only the current, nothing in the past. It's not relevant."
I get that. And I remember reading books like this years ago going, these are just stories. And a friend of mine who's a college professor, was talking to one of his students, and they go, why do we have to read all these studies, right? Like, why can't we just talk about stories of real people's lives? And the professor was like, that studies, that research is just curated stories, right? Like it's just, it's having a blind, test of 50 college students or talking to 500 people on the street. Like, it's just people's stories. And I think, if you listen to enough stories, if you study enough people, especially those who are, successful, then you start to see threads, right? And this is what I saw, from Michelangelo all the way up to Dr. Dre. Artists who are successful tend to do a lot of the same things. And it turns out that artists who are unsuccessful tend to not do those same things. Can we see with a certain degree of certainty that there's some correlation here? I think so. And there are some really fascinating studies. You can Google the SNAP study, SNAAP. It's a study of art students, tens of thousands of art students every year, how successful they are, how happy they are. Remember that study years ago where they found out that 87% of the world's workers were disengaged in their work? It was a Gallup poll. It turns out that for art students, and these aren't all artists, you don't have to go to art school to be an artist, but this is sort of the traditional path. Turns out, that 89% of those people are very happy and successful in their careers. Again, I think the story of the starving artist is a myth. It's a story that we tell ourselves. If we believe it, it becomes true. And all I wanted to do with this book is say, hey, here's another side of the story. And if you believe this tends to become true. Here are the two different paths. You decide which one you want to take.
I can guarantee the audience out there that if they can't find an aha moment, they are probably in desperate need of a frontal lobotomy, a straitjacket, and they can just rest for the rest of their life. Because if you can't find an aha moment in your book, Jeff, someone's got something drastically wrong with them. The book, Real Artists Don't Starve, Timeless Strategies for Thriving in the New Creative Age, will be available everywhere, Amazon, you name it. If you can't find it, again, there's something wrong with you. Jeff, where is the best place that we can send everybody to come check you out more?
You can learn more about the book at don'tstarve.com. There's lots of great free resources there as well. And you can find me at my website, Goins Writer, just like coins, but with a G, Goins writer.com.
Jeff, cool stuff. I can't wait for the next book.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.